Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to talk about sampling. Uh, I know some of you probably have an idea of what sampling is, and for others, this may be the first time that you're hearing about the term sampling. And so, in basic terms, um, when we talk about sampling, we're talking about selection. Talking about selection. Um, and so, in research, we have to select the participants that we need for a study. Um, and these may be things or people, um, or maybe a group of people or items that we want to use for our study in terms of what we want to observe, in terms of what we want to measure, etc. and etc. So today we will look at sampling itself and talk about um, some of the components of sampling. The first thing that we will look at is to examine the difference between um, what a sample is and what a population is. Um, so a population is a set that includes all the measurements of interest. Um, so that would mean the collection of all the responses or measurements or things that are counted that are of interest to that person. So an example would be that if we're doing a study about um, childhood obesity among kindergarten children in the city of Owensville, that would be the population will be the entire um, number of students. There's a total number of um, children that are enrolled in kindergarten class in the city of Owensville. But in some instances, or in many instances, what we find is that it is very difficult to access all of the members of a population, all of the members of a group that we're considering to collect data from. And so we would often use what is called the sample or the subset of the population as you find in the diagram. And so the sample is a subset of the population. That's a smaller unit within the population. Um, And so that brings us to the question of why do we do sampling? Why don't we just use the entire population that we want to study? In some instances, using the entire population is feasible. That is when we have a much smaller population size. If we're looking at a class of students, that could be a sample for your study. That means you have, let's say, 20 students in a class that you want to use for a study um, that focuses on that particular class. Then yes, that would be the population for that study. Um, but sometimes that's not always feasible, um, and so we would have to look at a subset of the population. Getting information about large population is very expensive. Um, it takes a lot of time, and sometimes um, it is impossible, nearly impossible to study the entire population. And so we have to look at a segment of that population that we can use for our study. Um, the thing about sampling also is that we want to make sure that we have information um, about that population that is um, accurate. And so we want to work with a manageable and a controllable um, size that will provide us with the information that we need. Uh, in every study, we have what we call the target population. And the target population is the population to be studied to which the investigator wants to generalize the results. Um, that is the total number of people under consideration. Um, the next thing is the sampling unit, um, which is the group from which the sample can be selected. Um, and the sampling unit is usually the smallest unit from which a sample can be selected. So let's say if we're looking at students in college, um, our sample, our target population could be students um, in the United States of America, all the students, college students in the United States of America. But a sampling unit could be maybe a particular school that we're looking at. Uh, let's say we want to look at students that enrolled in HBCUs. So the target population would be students in all enrolled in HBCUs across the U.S. But the sampling unit, because of problems of accessibility, would be a particular university that we want to use. And then in some instances, even HBCUs or smaller universities have students population that are quite large, let's say like 3 or 4 thousand students. It may be difficult or nearly impossible to collect data from all of the students. And so we would have to find a way to get information from some of the students that we would use to um, make some guesses or estimation about the entire population. Um, and so we would use what we call the sampling frame, which is the list of all the sampling units from which a sample is drawn. Um, and we have to think about a particular method that we would use to pull out this information from the sampling frame, and that's talking about the sampling scheme that we use in our studies. Um, in terms of sampling itself, um, we have uh, a focus on the type of samples that we want. And the two basic types of samples that we have is what we call the non-probability and probability samples. Um, the non-probability sampling is the type in which we want to collect um, in the non-probability sampling, not every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Uh, that's a type of sampling in which is done randomly. But a probability sampling is a type of sampling in which every member has some chance of being selected. And non-probability sampling itself has two major types. Um, so we have what we call the um, non-purposive and purposive non-probability. The non-purposive um, is a type of non-probability samples in which we're choosing from an accessible, though unknown population without regard for randomness. But the purposive sampling is the method in which we do the selection in a random way. And we do the selection in this particular way because of the specific characteristics uh, uh, based on the knowledge of some of the specific characteristics we have about the population and the study purpose. So we have some pre-information about what the sample looks like, and that is the basis upon which we are making that determination. Um, Another thing that we want to pay attention to is Another thing that we want to pay attention to is the different types of purposive and non-purposive samples. We have what we call the accidental um, sample, in which there is a bit of um, unplannedness. That's the word that I want to use, which is that it's not very organized. So in accidental, haphazard, or convenient sampling, we could just use about anybody that's available. So an example could be like the man on the street, um, students that are available in the class, clients that are accessible to us, or volunteer samples. An example could be snowball sampling. This is a type of sampling in which um, you would recruit one person, and then that person will share information about um, the proposed study that you intend to do, and then from there um, get someone else recruited for the study, and then another, and that person also continues in the chain. So it's more like a chain sampling. Um, the good thing about purposive sampling is that we have what we call predetermined groups, and so we can deliberately um, sample extreme groups, but there are problems often with proportionality. Uh, Purposive sampling is often used when we have an intent. Let me give you an example. So, um, you maybe are doing a study that focuses on the perceptions of immigrants about the recent immigration policies. And if you narrow that down and say, okay, maybe you wanted to look at specifically um, perception of Latin American immigrants about Trump's anti-immigration policies, then you want to have people that are from those countries. And so you would have to define what the group is, and you would have to deliberately sample um, those group of people. And so there's a deliberateness to it, and there is a focus on pre-defined groups. However, um, there is that tendency that we may get, there is that possibility that we may not get information from, um, we may not get good representation in terms of the people that are participating in the study. So there is a tendency that we may not correctly sample, um, and we may end up with a group that's very extreme that does not reflect what the reality is. Other types of purposive sampling are like the model instance, where we look at the typical case. Uh, but sometimes determining what the typical case is uh, a judgment call. How do we determine what's a typical case? So let's say like a typical student, a typical voter, a typical mental health issue. Uh, this would be that something may not be um, that it could create problems of proportionately representing the model group. Um, and so this type of sampling also may not be appropriate for certain types of studies that we intend to carry out. Another type of sampling is expert sampling, where we could focus on recruiting people that are knowledgeable about a particular um, subject area that we're looking at. And in expert sampling, sometimes we would use a panel of experts to make judgments about the representativeness. An advantage of expert sampling is that you could say the experts support the sampling. However, even the experts may be wrong um, when it comes to selecting right people,